Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Senator.
Thanks, Max.
So you've been a strong supporter of Israel for decades, and you made a point to have your first trip abroad, Senator from Utah, be to Israel. Can you talk about the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship and why it's so important for Israel to remain a bipartisan issue?
Well, there is a competition going on. Competition is kind of a mild word for what's going on between authoritarian states and I'll call them free states, and the authoritarians are winning these days. Authoritarian nations like China and Russia are exporting their technology, are exporting their capacity to interfere in elections, democratic elections, and they're trying to push their model such that free countries like ourselves are not able to compete economically, militarily, geopolitically. And Israel is a nation that is also a democracy that stands in a very difficult neighborhood, and that is a model in its region for the advantages of having a democracy in terms of technology, innovation, economic vitality, military prowess, and so forth. So a relationship with Israel communicates to a significant part of the world that the democracy works, that it's a model which is every bit as good as, and in fact, a lot better than the authoritarian model.
And what about the concern from some that Israel is now becoming a partisan issue? How can we continue to make sure that Israel remains something that's bipartisan going forward?
Well, everything becomes partisan in our country these days, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I would think there would be a recognition on the part of people on both sides of the aisle that we are in a competition with the authoritarian states, that Israel is a nation which shares many of our values, and we very badly want to align our interests with that of Israel. I think that right now the question of the Palestinians figures into that calculus, and I think the administration and the moves it's recently made will perhaps bring the temperature down somewhat.
Absolutely. So what's your strong opposition to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that seeks to delegitimize Israel, both on college campuses and in governments worldwide?
Well, any effort to weaken or minimize a democratic nation that shares our values is an effort that basically shoots us in our own foot or our own nose or whatever you want, whichever part of your body you want to talk about. We want to encourage nations where we have disagreements to try and make changes that would make them comport more to what our values might be. Yep. But you don't attack or try and weaken a country which shares our values and which is one of the nations which is standing up in this region for principles of democracy and human rights.
Yep, and as you just noted, Israel has emerged as one of the global innovation leaders, and you've also spoken at times over the past few years about how Israelis have a special sense of purpose. Can you talk more about why you think Israel has been so successful in business and what this special sense of purpose is that Israelis have?
You know, I think that all people find their lives more fulfilling if they have a purpose greater than just themselves. And David Brooks, a columnist of the New York Times, just wrote a book called The Second Mountain, in which he says that much of happiness in a person's life is associated with whether they have a purpose greater than just the selfish requirements. And I think the people of Israel have come together to form a nation which is designed to return to them a Jewish state with the kind of freedom from oppression which they have experienced throughout the world, and most horrifically and notably during the Second World War. So I think that brings a purpose to many people. A religion brings a purpose to others. Yep. Our own nation brings purpose to people who make this our home. So I don't think it's unusual that Israelis would have that feeling of conviction about their country. I would note that whether it's cultural or any other means, the people in Israel have created what some have called a startup nation, which means it is the most prolific of nations in the world, particularly on a per capita basis, in starting new businesses that become highly successful. That's part of the culture. It's part of what's driven Israel to be a leader in the free world.
Absolutely. Although it was an unpopular decision in your party, you voted to convict President Trump in recent impeachment proceedings. I think a lot of students on campus today who support Israel can relate to being in the minority point of view. So can you discuss a little bit about what went into your vote, but more importantly, what advice you have for pro-Israel students who have been afraid to speak up because they fear retribution?
Yeah, just a little background, which is if you've been in politics a long time, and I have for a number of years now, even though my life was really in business, politics has been my avocation for quite some time. During a process like that, I can admit that there have been a couple of occasions where I have made a choice which was more expedient than it was based upon conscience. And at the time, I convinced myself that what I was doing was the right thing to do. But looking back, I recognized, and I probably knew it at the time as well in my heart, that what I was doing was politically expedient. And those decisions still haunt me to this day. Even though I've made myriad decisions since then, the fact that there are some things that were not consistent with my fundamental beliefs really grates at me. And at this stage of my life, I've decided not to do that anymore. And to call them like I see them and not worry about the consequences. And I mean, I think for young people coming along, I would make the observation that if you ever make a choice or a decision which is inconsistent with your fundamental beliefs, you're going to regret it. And it's not just regretting it for a day or two, you're going to regret it the rest of your life. And there's nothing quite as exhilarating and uplifting as being able to speak your mind and speak your conscience, even if there are consequences, and potentially and particularly when there are consequences of having done so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Romney. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Max. Good to be with you.
Thank you.